Support for WUWM podcast comes from Life Navigators, your disability partner, offering disability services for over 75 years. More on their family resources at lifenavigators.org or their helpline, 414-774-6255.
From 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, this is Lake Effect. I'm Joy Powers. Today we'll explore why lease agreements are allowing closed-down Walgreens stores in Milwaukee to sit vacant.
Now, if you live in one of those communities, you're just kind of subject to this agreement that you had no control over, nothing to do with. And yeah, it could have a big impact on the neighborhood.
Then we'll learn about the House of History, a project dedicated to sharing local Black LGBTQ history.
My goal is to get the word out that we're here, and a lot of the sacrifices that were made by some of the people who are no longer here, their legacy can live on.
Plus, we'll hear some new local music in the Milwaukee Music Roundup. All of that is coming up on Lake Effect. This is Lake Effect from 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Joy Powers, and thank you so much for joining us. Recent reporting from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel looked into Walgreens leases throughout the city. The reporting found that leases contain terms that restrict pharmacies and other businesses from moving into the stores. And those leases can last for decades, so long as the company continues to pay rent. One of the closed-down Walgreens locations on North King Drive and West Hadley Street has a lease that was signed in 2009 and lasts until 2084, preventing new businesses from moving in. WUWM's race and ethnicity reporter Taryn Powell is joined by real estate expert Chad Venn to learn about these types of leases and their provisions.
I'll just give you kind of a general overview on how a lot of commercial leases work, and they're much different than a multifamily or residential lease that you would see in an apartment. A lot of that language is governed by state statutes, and landlords have a very strict guidelines that they have to follow to make sure that everything is legally in compliance. When you're talking about commercial leases, and that's, agreements that are in place between people who own buildings like office buildings, retail shopping centers, industrial buildings, the terms of those leases are much more negotiable. And obviously there's some legal standards that they have to follow, but they're governed a lot more by the business terms that the building owner and the tenant negotiate and come to terms with. When you talk about tenants like Walgreens, these are major, large corporate organizations, and a lot of times they operate with somewhat of a standard lease template that they start the negotiations with. And so a lot of the clauses that you see contained within these Walgreens leases, even though that there are negotiations that are going to change them site to site, many of the key provisions that are in them are just part of their standard lease that they agree to. And one of the questions I think that you had was about this idea of the exclusive use. And while it might be kind of an odd concept to, consumers in neighborhoods or people unfamiliar with this, it's actually very common in these retail leases, especially when you're dealing with these larger corporate users like a Walgreens or a CVS or a lot of grocery stores. And the intent behind the exclusive use clause is to basically protect the business from competition coming into a center. And so when these agreements are put in place, I'll use an example of like a coffee shop. If you are an operator of a coffee shop, whether that's Starbucks or even a small neighborhood coffee shop, you want some protections from the landlord being able to put a competitor in, on the same building in the same shopping center as you do, because it's going to impact your sales. And so these exclusive use clauses are in there to really guard against the tenant's business. And in the case of Walgreens, there's the discussion about the pharmacy and the other restrictions that are able to happen within that center. And so I think the intent when they're signing these leases is to really kind of protect against a landlord having the ability to put competitors in a same site, a same center to impede on their business. So in addition to the exclusive use, which kind of protects the tenant and gives them the sole right to operate that type of business in a shopping center, there's also things like the prohibited use that you see in a lot of commercial leases can call out specific things that tenants and future tenants don't have the ability to do within a center. And so sometimes those are written in there for the benefit of the landlord. And sometimes in the case of these larger corporate users, they're also put in place to kind of protect the building or the business that's operating within that building. And so a lot of these restrictions are things that either the building owner or large corporate tenants look at as a way to protect against reputation of the building, synergies of the building. And so a lot of these larger corporations, they have an image and a brand that they're trying to convey, and they want to make sure that if they're going to commit to a long-term lease in a place, that the landlord doesn't just have the ability to put any type of operation they want in a shopping center that they might view as an impact to their brand reputation or to the use that they're looking to operate. What makes these Walgreens leases so complicated is that they're so long. And so many of the base leases that you see for a store like Walgreens start at something like 25 years on average. And so 25 years is a long time. And as the economy changes, as consumer behavior changes, it's really hard to see how some of these clauses are going to play out years down the road, decades down the road. In addition to the long term that they have of these leases, many of them also have renewal clauses in there, which allow the tenant the ability to continue their lease on, usually for 5-year additional terms. And so when you look at the article in JS Online, it's referencing, I think 75 to 80 years. Well, what that's taking into consideration is the original 25 years of that lease, plus these additional renewal options that get put on the end of the lease term. And from the business's standpoint, they like those renewal options because if they're going to invest in a community, invest in a center, they want to make sure that they have the ability to maintain control of that space for a long period of time. And these leases that you see with the Walgreenses of the world are much longer than we see with a lot of traditional retailers in space, but the general terms are pretty common in the industry.
It's interesting to have these long kind of terms with just uncertainty of whether you will return. I guess that's what's kind of tripping me up a little bit.
What's hard for people that live in any community is that a lot of times these agreements happen between a user and an owner of a building. And, when they're usually on the front end of it, it's with the best intent, right? When Walgreens signs this lease, when the landlord agrees to this lease, it's to provide long-term services for these communities. So they lock in these long-term leases, I don't believe, to control and monopolize an area as much as they just want to ensure that they have control to run the business. Mm-hmm. Now, over multiple decades, as I mentioned, consumer behavior changes. And so you're seeing a lot of these stores now closing that I don't believe it was the initial intent to let's just open a bunch of stores, see what works, and then close down the ones that don't. Mm. I think it's done with the intent of we want to be here long term. Now, if you live in one of those communities, you're just kind of subject to this agreement that you had no control over, nothing to do with. Right. And it could have a big impact on the neighborhood. I think what's kind of important to know, and this is it's kind of confusing in itself as well, but the tenant is technically in a valid lease for many of these situations. And so as long as they're paying rent, the original lease is still there. And certain leases have clauses in them. Like, for example, there's a clause called, a dark store or a dark closure, where if a landlord has a concern that this could happen, they have the ability to write that into a lease that a tenant doesn't have the ability to just close a store down and stop operating in it without the lease becoming invalid. And that's the landlord's way of protecting the integrity of their center, the other tenants that are in the center. Because if you bring in a large operator like a grocery store or a pharmacy, that draws a lot of other businesses to the area. And those other businesses are there because they know the foot traffic and the pedestrians that are being brought in because of that user. And so they want to make sure that if they're going to commit to a lease that is outside of their control, that the large big box tenant that's kind of anchoring that center doesn't have the ability to just turn the lights off, walk away, stop operating, but still remain under a valid lease. That's one of those points that's negotiated, however. So if you're a landlord and you're dealing with a large credit tenant like a Walgreens, you might not have that ability to negotiate that into a lease because, frankly, some of these tenants are very desirable for owners. And so they will concede on things for these larger operators than they would, like a smaller neighborhood startup company.
Very, very fascinating.
It's a unique place to be in for these centers because I'm speaking in generalities here. I'm not saying that this is across the board, but there could very well be a dark store with nobody operating, with no intent to move back. But as long as the tenant is still paying rent on that space, they remain a valid tenant under the terms of that lease. And with that valid lease stays those inclusive use clauses. Those prohibited use clauses they remain in effect. Now, some of these leases will also have things like sublease clauses in there, which gives the tenant the ability to try to locate another tenant to take over their lease. On occasion, there's conversations where landlords kind of recognize what's happening and they can try to negotiate to get out of that lease. But everything requires approval on both ends because the lease is the lease and it's the letter of the law until somebody is in default. And as long as they continue to pay and they're operating under the terms of their lease, there's really limited legal action that could be taken.
I'm glad you said that because I had a question about whether, it even makes sense to take legal action in these cases. Are you aware of any other, like if it's elsewhere, if it's Milwaukee area, like if there have been any like legal challenges or like pushback to situations like this?
Sure. There's been challenges to these in areas like San Francisco, New York, bigger cities that, don't. What they're trying to implement, and I don't have all the specifics to this, but I know that certain municipalities are trying to add like a vacancy tax would be a way of looking at it. So if you're going to just own a property and not have anything operating in there, you still have the legal ability to do so, but they're going to try to charge you some sort of a tax or a fee to try to encourage landlords and tenants to renegotiate these terms to get out of it because nobody wants to see an empty storefront. I mean, the building owner doesn't, other tenants don't want, neighbors don't want it, cities don't want it. So there are a lot of areas where people are trying to work on ways that, they can work around it. But legally, as far as I'm aware, I'm not aware of anything here locally that has been successful or anything that's even been discussed that could kind of operate along those same terms.
So I guess my final question, can you speak to the barriers this creates for those? I said, earlier, it's predominantly been Black and brown communities where these Walgreens have closed. And with these exclusions, certain industries cannot open up because of these, term agreements. Can you just speak to like the barriers that this might create for those communities?
Yeah, it creates a very challenging situation, no doubt. You have what were kind of center points of many communities. Walgreens was kind of notorious for getting the best locations in each area. And it's got to be very challenging for people who live in those communities who have these prime centers that don't have an operating service providing those needs anymore. And it create some legal challenges because, as I stated, these leases don't really have a way to unwind them without people agreeing to do so. And if there were another operator or another user that would be willing to step in to that space, in many cases, it's going to require Walgreens or the tenant in this case to sign off on it, and then the owner to sign off on it as well. And if Walgreens is in place with a really strong lease, it's going to require probably somebody at that level to step in to take over the lease for everyone to be able to agree to it. And so it's got to be very frustrating for people in the communities that have relied on these services that don't have that asset anymore that they can rely on. And it doesn't have a really easy answer to it. And if you're people who live in areas where this is affected by you, I do imagine it puts a lot of extra stress and strain on trying to have to find ways to kind of relocate those services that are there. From a real estate perspective, it is challenging though. And I think if there was an easy answer, people would be able to try to figure out ways to solve it. The hope would be that another operator sees promise in a neighborhood or a community and sees the value in it and wants to be able to approach either the owner or the tenant to take over and run their business there.
Chad Venn is the director of the real estate program with UW-Milwaukee's Lubar School of Business. He spoke with WUWM's race and ethnicity reporter Taryn Powell. Lake Effect is available as a podcast, so you can listen when you like. Find it wherever you get your podcasts, then subscribe, download, and listen on demand. One of the most successful tabletop games of all time got its start right here in Wisconsin. We'll share the origin story of Dungeons and Dragons in about 15 minutes. But first, we'll learn about the House of History, a project that preserves Milwaukee's LGBTQ stories and experiences. That's coming up next on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. You're listening to Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers. Janice Toy has long been a part of Milwaukee's LGBTQ history. She's one of Milwaukee's most legendary entertainers and one of the founding members of SHEBA, or Sisters Helping Each Other Battle Adversity, a support group for Black women of trans experience. Toy is also the mother of the House of History. The project is dedicated to collecting and sharing local Black LGBTQ history through interviews and photographs. Lake Effect's Audrey Nowakowski is joined by Toy to learn how she went from being a part of local Black LGBTQ history to preserving it.
Well, with the House of History, this gives me the opportunity to, I guess, document a lot of the girls who have passed, I guess to document, their life legacy, because sometimes when people die, we forget. And a lot of the younger transgender community, they don't know the struggles that a lot of the girls had to go through before them. Now there's a lot of programs, that's targeted to kind of help transgender. But when I first came out, a lot of those programs weren't available, so they don't know the struggles and the hard work that the older girls had to put in, and a lot of the newer girls, that's just coming out and don't even know that it was a girl who, who the struggles that she went to get, it passed for us to get our name changed and, to just to be able to live, this lifestyle that people take, advantage of, so.
Can you share how it was born? I understand you connected with Bryce Smith of the LGBTQ Milwaukee, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Can you share how you both came together to bring this idea about?
Well, he was interviewing just some SHEBA, members. And it was just like a instant connection me and him had, and then he just just introduced me to other different, programs and stuff that he had and, ideas that, he wanted to, bring about. And I just jumped aboard and it was like an instant connection.
Yeah, he was originally in touch with you to learn more about Sheba, which is sisters helping each other battling adversity, and talking about the programs that exist today. You're one of the founding members of Sheba. I'd love to learn more about why and how you started this organization and what it looked like in its early days compared to now.
Well, Sheba, it was a group because I was just one of the first members that joined. But it started off with sisters helping each other battle AIDS. But then a lot of girls kind of were, I guess they didn't like the title, of AIDS being associated, with being, transgender or whatever. Because I guess a lot of people got a misunderstanding that everybody that was in the group or in order to be a part of the group, you had to be, HIV positive, which wasn't the case. And so, they wanted to take away that negative title. So then it got changed to, adversity or whatever. But, we involved, now it's kind of like, they help with a lot of employment. They do clothing drives. They do more outings. They offer needle exchange. They offer programs to help girls get hormones. Because I guess in the earlier days, a lot of those programs weren't available, to us as transgender. A lot of, people, if you didn't have insurance or you just didn't have the money, you were just buying it, from off the street, whatever. So it's kind of like we, offer a lot of different things to help girls, to stay on the right path, and because a lot of times, people think that Black trans women or trans, people in general, the only thing that we were eligible for was either sex work or doing drag shows. We couldn't have like a regular job. We couldn't, have the things that a normal person in society, they felt like, we weren't, entitled to those things, and now Sheba is, we promote jobs and getting people, into, careers and different things like that.
If you're comfortable, would you mind sharing about your own journey coming out and your relationship with your mother and how she influenced your outlook and activism in helping other people in the roles you play yourself?
I had a very strong, relationship with my mother. My mother, unfortunately, I lost her a few years ago due to COVID. But, she was a very strong person in my life. Like I said, we were very, very close. She didn't look at me, differently or treated me any differently. She always gave me the motivation that I needed and pushed me, to want different things in my life. And she always made me believe that I could do anything, regardless of my sexuality or because I chose to be trans. She always, told me that, I could always come to her and I could talk to her about anything. I didn't have to feel embarrassed or, and she opened her, her home to any other, all of my friends. Like if people, didn't have anything to eat, they were able to come to her house and sit down and get a meal. If they needed a place to stay, she opened up her house to them. My mother was very loving, and very supportive, of my lifestyle. And I guess because of that, I was able to give back. And I guess I just felt, like there was always something I wanted to do to help others because was fortunate enough to have someone in my life, because a lot of times, family members, they turn their back on you once they find out, that you're trans or you're even living into a gay lifestyle, they turn their back on you. And I had a strong support system. My family was very supportive. And so I just wanted other girls to share in that, they too could, have someone in their corner to pick them up. I wanted them to feel that family support, that I felt coming up.
What did you discover about yourself when you took on the role of interviewing people and these members of the Black LGBTQ community?
Everyone has a story to tell. And sometimes, because we had like a general questions, that we kind of like asked everyone, but everyone had like a different answer. And some things you didn't even know about. I didn't even know about, some of the individuals, and I've been knowing some of them for years, but when you start getting into asking certain questions, you just got, all these different answers, and then it was opening up, because, it was more like a friendship type of thing. So they were comfortable with sharing these stories, something that, they probably wouldn't have told anyone else, but because they felt comfortable with our friendship, they opened up and they didn't have a problem with, sharing these different things. And some of these stories I was even blown away by.
And along with the people you talk to, the sense of place and community also plays a big role for Milwaukee's queer community. And most people are familiar with Walker's Point being the area with most of the city's gay bars, but can you share the history of the gay bars on Milwaukee's north side and the role that they played in your life?
A lot of the bars that I guess I went to on the north side when I first came out are no longer here. But when they were open, it just gave me a place of being able to be myself. I didn't have to hide who I was. I didn't have to pretend, and put on a fake smile. I could let my hair down. I could just be myself. And it was a loving, situation, because it was like you were around like-minded people, that didn't judge you or didn't look down on you because of something that you had on or because, you were different. It was just, I guess, just a loving, situation, to be around people, that didn't judge you, and you were able to have a good time.
And with you yourself learning new things with people you've known for years, collecting their histories, how do you hope the House of History Project will connect with and impact Black LGBTQ plus Milwaukeeans especially?
Well, I guess my goal is to get the word out, that we're here. And a lot of the sacrifices that were made by some of the people who are no longer here, their legacy can live on, because everyone in our family, has someone in the LGBT community, whether they want to admit it or not, it's someone in somebody's family, whether they're in the closet or they're not. And, their stories, need to be told. This was a way that, it was a life-changing experience, and it was a way to make history and, to keep history, going. And I think that this website, would give that. I get that opportunity, to get that word out and get that connection, that we need.
Absolutely. Well, Janice, I want to thank you so much for your time today and for all your work in preserving this local history.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to me and, just being, that connection that we need, to get the word out.
Janice Toy is the mother of the House of History, a project dedicated to collecting and sharing local Black LGBTQ history. She spoke with Lake Effect's Audrey Nowakowski in 2023. Since it was first created in the 1970s, Dungeons & Dragons has become an international phenomenon. It was the first role-playing game with major commercial success, but few know it all began right here in Wisconsin. Writer T. Krulos joins me to uncover this history. People are actually often surprised to learn that D&D is from Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Even folks who are from here. And I think part of that is that the history hasn't necessarily been celebrated locally. But let's dig into it. How did Dungeons and Dragons first come to be?
Yes. Well, it starts with a guy named Gary Gygax and his friend at the time, Dave Arneson. They're both very much into war-playing games, and were trying to create their own games, and they kind of put their ideas together and formed this game that really revolutionized the gaming industry called Dungeons and Dragons. And this was the first sort of game where you could interact by sort of becoming one of the characters. You would build your character that was a barbarian or a wizard or some sort of warrior, and then the dungeon master leads your group through this game, and you have to collaborate together to find treasure and fight monsters. And it's a really fun adventure and a way to kind of bond with your fellow game players.
The development of it was interesting. As you say, both Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson were very into war games. I believe that's how they met. Mm-hmm. And Gary, I know, had designed a game called Chainmail.
Right.
This ended up being kind of a game that was really focused on the rules, but as you say, Arneson brought in this idea of kind of character play.
Yeah, Arneson had been working on a game called Blackmore. So, they kind of took some of the best elements of both of those games and created this entirely new thing.
Yeah. Now, as someone who grew up in Lake Geneva, I actually knew Gary Gygax quite well. I also had friends whose parents worked at TSR, which was the company that he made. That has a really complicated history in the city of Lake Geneva. Can you tell us a bit about that?
I mean, one thing that I really love about the story is that Lake Geneva developed this big company. So at one point they employed like about 400 people, which is a pretty good part of the population of Lake Geneva. They kind of took over the town and imported all of these writers and artists and game editors. And it just must have been like such an exciting time. But, there were some Game of Thrones style twists to the company, I would say. First, Gygax and Arneson had a bad falling out, and Arneson had to take legal action so he could get a piece of game royalties. And then Gary went from being very poor to being pretty rich in a short amount of space. And I think that a lot of people don't know how to handle that influx of money. So he didn't spend it very wisely. And eventually his own company ousted him from the company in the mid-'80s. The new head was a woman named Lorraine Williams, and she ran the company until the late 90s when they were in really bad financial straits, and the company was bought by Wizards of the Coast, which is a company from the Seattle area that created Magic the Gathering. So they bought the company, and they still own it and are producing the game. And it's really kind of amazing. Dungeons & Dragons is still a very popular property, even in this digital age.
It does continue to have a bit of a footprint in Lake Geneva, as you say. A lot of people moved to this small town for this reason. Now, I will say that point in Lake Geneva's history, as somebody who was from there, Lake Geneva also had the Playboy Hotel that was just on the outskirts. Right. So you have the Playboy Hotel, you have TSR, which is right downtown. It's where the Kilwin's ice cream place is now. Mm-hmm. And you, of course, had the lake and all of the tourism that came along with the lake that honestly predates all of this, is really from like the Great Chicago Fire when tourism starts in Lake Geneva. Right. But with all of that in mind, it still seems like the city hasn't really latched onto this history in quite the way you might expect for such a cultural phenomenon.
Yeah, it's only been in very recent years that this history is sort of acknowledged and celebrated in any way. But a long period of time went by. But now there is a group called the Gygax Memorial Fund, and they've slowly been getting some recognition in the city. So, for example, there's some memorial markers by like Horticultural Hall, which is where the first Gen Con took place.
Gen Con named for
Geneva Convention. Yeah, a lot of people don't know that, especially because it's not in Wisconsin anymore, unfortunately. But that's where it started, and it was a very small, humble event, and now it's the largest gaming convention in North America. So 70,000 plus people go to Gen Con nowadays, and it started with less than 100 people. So The Gygax Memorial Fund has also set up a reading alcove in the Lake Geneva Library, which is a beautiful library, by the way. And this alcove includes books that were influential on Gary Gygax. So there's a lot of works by J.R.R. Tolkien and H.P. Lovecraft and stuff like that. And probably the biggest thing that they've been working on is they're building a memorial statue of Gary Gygax in the park near the library. And it's going to feature him sitting at a table. And I love this detail. His hand is outstretched, and it's what's called a dice tower. So you drop dice, and it'll come shooting out of his hand onto the table. And people can sit there with him at this table and play Dungeons and Dragons or read a book or do whatever they want. So that's a project that they're currently working on.
Yeah. I was chatting with Gary's widow, Gail Gygax, and I believe they're even going to print some of his original games on the table itself.
Right, yes. Ones that he designed, yeah.
Yeah.
They're also having a Dragon Days celebration. And it's kind of a fun small-town fair meets Ren Fair, sort of a mashup. There's like they're setting up some hay bales, so there's a maze that kids can go through, and there's vendors and special readings and screenings of the old Dungeons and Dragons cartoon, which was a brief thing in the 80s. So it's just kind of a fun weekend where the local businesses are celebrating this history.
Very nice. Well, T, thank you as always for joining us here on Lake Effect.
Thanks for having me.
T. Krulos is a writer and author. He wrote about the history of Dungeons and Dragons for Milwaukee Magazine in 2024, which is when we spoke. Dragon Days is happening in Lake Geneva this year on October 3rd and 4th. Still to come, we'll hear some new local music in this month's Milwaukee Music Roundup. That's next on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. This is Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers. Every month, Matt Wild from Milwaukee Record creates a list of some of the best new songs from local musicians. And every month, he shares a few of those songs with us for the Milwaukee Music Roundup. Matt Wild, as always, thanks for joining us on Lake Effect.
Well, thank you for having me back.
So this first group features a WUWMer, as you may know, Aaron Bagata, our lovely creative manager. This is Fellow Kinsmen. Now, they describe themselves as landlocked surf rock, which does feel appropriate.
It does feel appropriate, and it feels appropriate for all of the songs that we're going to be discussing this time around. This is a very laid-back, summery, hazy vibe, up until the very last one, but we'll get to that. Yeah, so we have Fellow Kinsmen. They just put out a great new record. It is called Break Room. And the song we're going to be listening to is called The Glass. Now, Fellow Kinsmen, led by Nate Kinsman, and he's been around for a while, and this project has existed for a while, but I feel like with this particular record, Break Room, it feels more collaborative. With the full band, it's got more of a band vibe to it. And landlocked surf rock, that sounds about right. It is very laid back, hazy, a little bit of psych, a little bit of indie in there. It's a good vibe. The whole record is terrific, and this song in particular is a favorite of mine. So this is Fellow Kinsmen with The Glass.
Glass by Fellow Kinsmen. This next song that we're going to talk about has a very 90s, 2000s R&B feel. I'm not sure if we've actually talked about this artist previously. Hannah Simone?
Hannah Simone, yeah. I'd be surprised if we haven't talked to her, but maybe we haven't. But because she's one of these artists that has been around for a number of years now, and especially in the summer is incredibly busy. And that's kind of a theme for this week as well. Milwaukee artists who are very, very busy, especially in the summer, of course, when there's 1,000 festivals, 1,000 music series. And Hannah Simone, she is one of these she seems to be playing like every other day from now until September. And she has a new EP out. It is called Love Letter. And the song we're going to be listening to is called Red Lips. Now, like I said, Hannah Simone has been around for a while, and she does have this very kind of throwback kind of soul and R&B sound. With this record, I feel it's a bit of a reinvention or kind of a reaffirmation of who she is, both as a person and as an artist. I believe the name of the EP, Love Letter, it kind of refers to herself, that she's kind of writing and sending love letters to her younger self. It's really, it's a very, very personal album and really, really lovely. And this song is, again, one of my favorites of the summer. It is Hannah Simone with Red Lips.
Makes me feel sick and bored. Thanks to you, went and outdid yourself. Bet you make your mama proud. Keep my hair tied back, wear the same old clothes. Look what you turned me into. Don't recognize this woman no more. No more of me is left to love you. How do I forget? Erase the messages you left. Gave the shirt off my back, now I'm stuck in this mess. If I really loved me, I'd find the strength to leave. But these chains so heavy got a hold on me. What's it gotta take to set me free? If I go down, you're coming down with me. You're going down, down. You're going down, down. You're going down, down. You're going down. Ran me dry, I was thirsty for love.
Red Lips by Hannah Simone. The next song we're talking about, it's a kind of funky ode to an idea that encapsulates one of the best and worst parts of Midwestern culture.
Yes, Midwest Nice. We'll be discussing Midwest Nice, that very concept, with the new song from Milwaukee artist Dak Dubois. He has a new record. It is called Trois, I believe. That's 3 in French, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. I know his last record was called 2, so now he's got Trois. Dak is a fantastic artist, a fantastic guitar player, and very, very much rooted in kind of a throwback kind of 70s psych and 70s rock, funk, soul sound. I know his personal recording studio, if you walked in there, it is literally like walking back to 1975, all this old vintage gear, the whole 9 yards. Dak is another Milwaukee artist who's very, very busy this summer. He just played both Milwaukee Records, Morgan Park Picnic. He also played Locust Street Festival. He's just every other day with this guy as well. So yeah, this is a real standout track from his new record. It is called Midwest Nice, and it's one of those things I guess exists. I don't know. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but it sure makes for a good song. This is Dak Dubois with Midwest Nice.
I don't need your advice, 'cause you're just Midwest Nice. Yeah, you hide your face behind the veil of false pleasantries. You don't amount to much, and you're lying right through your teeth. And I have tried to be your friend, but I don't know. give a damn about me. I don't need your advice, 'cause you're just Midwest nice. Midwest nice. You're just me. Midwest nice.
Midwest Nice by Dak Dubois. The final song we're talking about, it's very pop rock. This seems like it's part of a larger trend in Milwaukee. I feel like these really expansive feeling rock songs have been popping up a lot lately.
I think you're absolutely right. This is the group in question right now is Alley Eyes, and they have a new song, and it's called Punisher. And a couple of years ago, I think it was just last year, they put out a great record with a great name. It was called Bondage in the Afternoon. We may have discussed that. And you're right. I think this is part of a larger kind of look back on the aughts, kind of the early to mid-aughts, that kind of indie sleaze era a little bit, or even kind of anthemic, very, very glossy, very produced kind of indie rock and kind of pop rock sound. There are other groups like this. I'm thinking just off the top of my head, Gold Steps perhaps, kind of have a similar vibe. There are a bunch of these bands. And Alley Eyes, I think, is one of the, a fine example of it. Like I said, they put out a great EP last year, and they're back with a couple new songs this year. And this one, Punisher, I really get a kick out of this song. It kind of tells the story of a night out at a bar and just kind of the modern life of everything kind of encroaching. People staring at their phones, staring at AI junk on their phones, getting into arguments about politics and doing drugs in the bathroom. You know, very, very indie sleaze kind of vibe for the year of 2026. I know the album art for this single is taken outside the Oriental Theater, so I like to imagine that this song takes place next door at Landmark Lanes. And for that alone, I'm a big fan of this song. So this is the latest from Alley Eyes. It is called Punisher.
That's been stuck in decline. Patriots could save it if they just had the time. And I tell them, Eddie, brother, I don't see it that way. Sobriety confines me while I make my escape. Ages down the hallway, holding court at the bar, and he tells me that he thinks both sides are going too far. I'm gonna cut all ties, no communication, no more talking. I just can't take it. I just go. If it be alright with you.
Punisher by Alley Eyes. We are, I would say, fully in summer at this point. I think it's technically spring. I never know when summer really starts.
It's, Memorial Day weekend. For me, it's once like the Locust Street Festival rolls around, and that's already in a rear view mirror. So I'm officially calling it is Milwaukee summer. It's on.
What are you looking forward to, I guess, like in the next month? I will say it seems like the moment we get to this time of year, it's not even every weekend, it's every day there's something.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up because there are obviously there are more of these kind of street festivals, Brady Street Festival, Summer Solstice, all those. They're the big ones coming up, obviously Summerfest. But there are just dozens and dozens and dozens of smaller live music series that do take place like during the week, whether it's downtown here, whether it's at Lakefront Brewery, whether it's at, throw a dart at a dartboard, land on a bar or venue, and they've got a live music series that goes on throughout the week. That's what I'm looking forward to the most. All the big things and then all these smaller things. You cannot walk anywhere without bumping into live music in Milwaukee summer. So every single day, that's what I'm looking forward to this summer.
Very nice. Well, Matt Wild, thank you so much for joining us here on Lake Effect.
Thank you again.
Matt Wild is the co-founder of Milwaukee Record. Every month, he joins Lake Effect to talk about some of the best new music from local bands. At WUWM.com, you can find all of our previous conversations. And that wraps up today's show. Thank you so much for being here with us. I'm Joy Powers. If you missed any of Lake Effect this week, you can find all of our conversations at WUWM.com. If you'd like to take the show on the go, you can download the Lake Effect podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please join us again tomorrow during our local reporting Lasting Impact Member Drive. WUWM is hoping to grow our sustaining memberships. When you make a sustaining gift to WUWM, it helps us strengthen and ensure our future. Listen for more and make your contribution tomorrow during Lake Effect. Thanks so much for joining us right here on listener-supported 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.
Jason's back to screaming, so we'll